Hi, good afternoon. My name is Antony Alex. Welcome. I can already see quite a few of you have logged in, and I can see you all asking questions and making introductions on our chat. Welcome to the first of our 5 series webinars um, just for the internal committee, or IC as it's called, under the PoSH law 2013. We have created a set of 5 webinars just for those of you who are either on the internal committee or aspiring to be, or potential candidates on the internal committee of organizations. This series of webinars will take you through the basics that you need to know in order for you to be efficient and sort of conduct an investigation on behalf of your internal committee. So this is a 30-minute session. I'm going to sort of use the PowerPoint slide that we have in front of you to walk you through some of the key points. Towards the end, I will leave you with some other points that we're going to cover over the course of the next 4 sessions after this one. So please feel free to ask questions in the chat box that you have there. I've set aside another 15 minutes at the end of our session at 3:30 to take some of your questions and queries and sort of respond to them. So 3:30 to 3:45 is the time that we have set aside just for your questions. In the event any of you experience any difficulty in either seeing if the slides are changing, or if the audio is not clear, or not, or if I'm not audible at all, just refresh your link, and you should be able to sort of get with the most current page, and also probably hear my audio if you're having any difficulty at that point of time. So. Kavita, I've just mentioned that if you're not able to hear me, just refresh your link and you should be able to hear me. That should resolve any issues that you might have. All right. So without further ado, I'm going to get started. As I mentioned earlier, this is the first of the 5 webinars that we're going to be conducting. The dates of the future webinars are in front of you on your screen. The first one is what we're conducting today, which is going to be on the essentials of basically the basic skills that an IC member should possess. Thereafter, the next webinar, which is on 17th September, again at 3 p.m., will actually walk you through what the conciliation process is. It's one of the options that an internal committee or an IC has in its hands when it's conducting an inquiry process, or before conducting an inquiry process. The conciliation process is an option that they have as well. So we'll spend some time to sort of walk you through and educate you on how the conciliation process works and why it's such an effective tool in the hands of an IC. Thereafter, our sessions will split into 2, which is basically going to be the heart of the webinar, which is inquiry and investigation. This is going to be a 2-part series that is going to focus exclusively on best practices in conducting an inquiry. And thereafter, the second part, the first part will actually focus on sort of how, what the sort of theoretical aspects of an inquiry and investigation, how they are to be conducted, sprinkled with some anecdotes and case studies that we may have. The second one will focus more on evidence collection, and sort of how to examine witnesses. What are some of the key points that one must bear in mind when examining a witness? The next session will then thereafter will be sort of the second part of the 2-part session. The second part will be on 15th November, again at 3 p.m. And the last one will be on 13th December, again at 3 p.m., which is going to focus on documentation. As you may all be aware, documentation and order writing is absolutely critical to sort of being on an internal committee. And it's one of the most critical functions. Essentially, as you all know, the internal committee functions like a quasi-judicial body. Therefore, the very, very sort of the process that has to be followed by the committee is really one that has to check all the boxes from a sort of legal perspective or a judicial perspective. Order writing and documentation is a very important part of it, and that's something that we're going to spend about 30 minutes on during our last webinar on 13th December. And of course, for all of you who attend all the webinars, we have got a free PoSH policy. That's something that we have been that we'll be distributing to each and every one of you that's attended all the webinars. So that's sort of the just an introduction to what our calendar looks like. I'm going to sort of dive straight into the webinar. The law, the Prevention of Sexual Harassment law that was passed in 2013 has basically really made a sort of revolutionized, if I may say so, the way sexual harassment cases are being dealt with in our country. So we are now as you can see on the slide, we have, we're on slide 4 of 15 right now. And what we have here is basically the laws that are applicable in the event of, in the event of, this is basically the legal framework that governs sexual harassment at the workplace. You have the Prevention of Sexual Harassment Law of 2013, or the Act of 2013, and the rules that are made thereunder. So the rules are made in, again, the same year as the Act was passed, 2013. Then there is the Criminal Law Amendment Act. I'm not sure if how many of you are familiar with it, but actually, in addition to the Prevention of Sexual Harassment law that was passed in 2013, the law also amended the Indian Penal Code and made sexual harassment a criminal offense as well. Hence, the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 2013 is relevant, and the duty of an internal committee, as some of you may be aware, is really to ensure that in the event the aggrieved woman or the complainant wants to file a complaint with the police, file a criminal complaint or lodge an FIR with the police, it is the duty of the internal committee to support and help her file the FIR if so required. So that's what the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 2013 has achieved. It's for all of your information, by virtue of the amendments in the law in 2013, what has really happened is twofold. Sexual harassment is now a civil and a criminal offense. Those who are aggrieved and want to file seek civil remedy, they have to file it with the internal committee of your company. So every company that has more than 10 employees must set up an internal committee. And if a company doesn't have an internal committee, then you can file it with a complaint with what is called the local committee, which is really the committee that is in your district. So every district is bound by law to set up a local committee. The second option, if an aggrieved woman or a complainant so chooses, is to file a criminal complaint with the police or lodge an FIR, and the police then have to mandatorily sort of investigate and take that complaint forward, and if file a charge sheet and so on and so forth. So the entire process that happens in criminal law or as per criminal law would also be applicable. So that's what you see on screen here. We have the Prevention of Sexual Harassment Law 2013. We have the rules 2013. We have the Criminal Law Amendment Act, which makes it a criminal offense. You have civil procedure and evidence laws, again, these are laws that actually, there are some basic principles that must be followed by the internal committee, and those are sort of prescribed in the civil procedure and evidence laws. We'll be touching upon some of these that are essential for the IC's functioning during the course of the third and the fourth webinars that we have lined up. And lastly, you have the land revenue laws. And now some of you may be wondering, why land revenue laws? What is the connection between land revenue laws and sort of prevention of sexual harassment? Well, interestingly, as some of you may know, the Prevention of Sexual Harassment law actually gives the internal committee or the IC, or some of you may be familiar in calling it the ICC, but it's actually by an amendment to the law has now been changed. It's now called an IC. The IC has powers of a civil court. So they actually have the powers to freeze assets or attach properties or bank accounts and what have you of the respondent in the event there is a compensation awarded and the respondent is unable to pay those amounts. So the IC actually has the power to sort of freeze the assets, and that's what's really very interesting about this law and the powers that it gives the internal committee, made up of ordinary people like you and I, working in a company, and they have the powers of a court. So training of the IC, best practices, training of the IC, and so on and so forth assumes critical importance simply on this account. So that's basically an overview of the law. Moving on to actually the constitution of the IC. So as some of you may be aware, the IC is basically, this is basically what the law says as what should be the constitution of the IC. The law really mandates that there's got to be a minimum of 4 members, and at least 50% or more must be women. So an IC or an internal committee must comprise of at least 4 members. And at least if it's 4 members, then at least 2 out of those 4 have to be women. If it's 5, then at least 3 out of those 5 have to be women. So that's basically what the law has mandated. The presiding officer or the chairperson of the company must be a senior woman employee. And this is important to note that the presiding officer, who really sort of like the chairperson of a board, if you will, that individual must be a senior woman employee of the organization. There is a, for those organizations who don't have a senior woman employee, the law does provide you with a small sort of leeway there. They say that you can actually get your presiding officer from an affiliate company, one of the sister concerns or what have you, in the event you don't have a presiding officer from your own organization. Out of the 4, so 1 out of the 4 is the presiding officer, who must be a senior woman employee. At least another 2 have to be members with an interest in sort of women's issues. So that's what the law says. But really speaking, the IC has to be, what we typically recommend is make sure that there's representation from different divisions of businesses. What we've commonly seen is individuals from HR or legal tend to be on the committee, but we're also now seeing a trend where we are a lot of business partners and folks who are on the business side or on the sales side or operations. They're also sort of playing an active role or by being members of an internal committee. And the reason really is to ensure that there's not just a gender representation, but also representation from different parts of the business that makes it as close as possible to being representative of the company. Last but not the least, you have to, every company must have mandatorily an external member. Typically, these, because of the quasi-judicial nature of this function, we typically recommend that that person should be a lawyer with a background or familiarity with, either associated with an organization that, sort of has been involved in supporting, women and children with respect to women's issues, sexual harassment, and so on and so forth. Alternatively, the law also provides that you can get somebody from a non-governmental organization or an NGO. So that option is also available should you choose to do that. So that's basically, your external member. That is sort of your full. If you have 4 members, then that's really how the 4 members should be comprised of. We typically recommend that an organization should have 5 members, because it becomes easier then for an organization to actually conduct, when the hearings are conducted and completed, 5 members means that they can, even if there's disagreement amongst or within the IC, by majority, the IC can decide that by a majority of 3:2, they can decide that that is the way, that this should be carried forward, or that is a decision of the internal committee, so to speak. So that is how the composition or constitution of the IC is sort of determined by an organization. If you have more members, also again, the rules remain the same. The presiding officer must be a senior woman employee. You have to have an external member who has to be part of the IC, and importantly, there have to be at least 50% or more women who are a part of the IC. An important thing that one needs to sort of bear in mind is that the term of the IC is 3 years. Some organizations have extended it beyond 3 years. We don't recommend it because the law is very clear that the term of the IC is for an effective period of 3 years. So that's the maximum term that the law has provided for. The law does not provide for, an extension or, stepping off the IC and then stepping back on for another term of 3 years. None of that is expressly provided in the law. Therefore, we would always urge you to be careful and ensure that if the term of each internal, each member of the internal committee must not exceed 3 years. So sometimes you may have a situation where a member has joined and sort of left the organization a year from the date of joining, and a new person has joined. That new person's date of sort of tenure will be for a period of 3 years. So always bear in mind that 3 years is the maximum term for an IC, and no more than that. The presiding officers, the quorum, which is basically the minimum number of people that is required to sort of be on to hear a matter, is basically 3 members. The presiding officer's presence is mandatory. So a presiding officer cannot not attend a hearing. The presiding officer's presence is mandatory, and there must be a total of 3 members. So a hearing cannot be heard with less than 3 members. 3 is the minimum, or 3 is the quorum as it's called. So please ensure that the quorum is always maintained, and also keeping in with the objective and spirit of the law. Then you have to ensure that the 2 out of 3 members are women, if possible, because that's really what we believe the law envisages, that whether it's the quorum or whether it's the total composition of the IC, 50% must be women. So that's really the composition of the IC. I realize that I'm a little behind on schedule, so I'm going to move a little faster now. So these are basically your this is how some of the sort of highlights of what it means to be an IC member. Some of these things are very important for you to sort of bear in mind. An IC member has to be available to address matters. This is something that they are doing in addition to their sort of day job. So if you see point 2, managing personal and professional commitments, what it really means is that you're wearing, as an IC member, you're wearing 3 hats. Your personal hat at home, your professional hat at work, and on top of that, you've got the IC hat. If you've accepted and you're sitting on the board of an internal committee of an organization, then you have an obligation to ensure that you manage your personal and professional commitments, and you are always available to address matters. So the law prescribes that an IC must conclude its hearing within 90 days of the complaint coming in. Therefore, it is very important that each of you who is an IC member dedicates time to give time and dedicate time to hearing an IC matter to ensure that you are able to do justice. So that's sort of very, very critical. You have an obligation to sort of check for conflict of interest. Conflict of interest is when you have an interest in the case. So let me just take a step back. Part of being an internal committee member means that you also have to follow the principles of natural justice. That's what the law says. Principles of natural justice are twofold. You have to, everybody must be given a fair hearing. Both parties must be given a fair hearing, and one can't be a judge in your own cause. So I'll take both those issues. Not being a judge in your own cause really means that if there is a complaint against you, or if you are a complainant, then you do not have the ability to sit on the IC and also hear the case. You have to step off the IC. And of course, so when that happens, it's called, similarly, you may also have a conflict of interest by virtue of sort of knowing somebody who is very, very close, right? Somebody's very close to you. You work closely professionally with with the organization for many years. You may even be social or family friends. In all those situations, it is advisable for an IC member to step off the IC for that particular case and come back on at a later point of time. You have an obligation to investigate and conduct inquiry carefully and properly, and to ensure that justice is done. So that's one of the key aspects or key points of being an IC member. We have already discussed the principles of natural justice, not being a judge in your own cause, and giving both parties a fair hearing. This is the most cardinal principle that every IC member or members must follow. There is absolutely no exception, or the law or the courts do look upon violation of principles of natural justice very, very seriously. So this is the one thing that you must follow very carefully. A, give both parties a fair hearing, hear them both properly, give them both a fair hearing, and B, make sure that in the event you as an IC member are either a complainant or a respondent, you step off the IC. Plus, if you are very, very close to either party in a matter, make sure that you step aside, because justice must not only be done but seem to be done. The sense of fairness must be conveyed to the parties, so that the parties are comfortable and believe that the IC will always do justice. So that's a very important factor, and that's one of the few grounds on which higher courts tend to accept appeals from an IC if the principles of natural justice is not followed. Lastly, of course, powers of a civil court. As you all know, as I mentioned earlier, the IC is a very, very powerful body. And those powers have to be used carefully. You have the powers of a civil court that allows you to, an order from the IC to appear before it has to be treated by everybody to whom it's sent to sort of taken very seriously. They have to appear before it. You have the power to call for evidence. You have the power to call for, CCTV recordings and so on and so forth. So any order that an IC passes to a third party or even within the organization has to be treated as power, as one that has been issued by a civil court, and has to be taken very, very seriously. So that's sort of how the powers of the civil court. It's again an important factor, and it's very, very unique in our country. This is for the first time that ordinary people, non-lawyers, non-judges have been given so much power in an organization, and the reason for this is, of course, because the menace of sexual harassment has to be stamped out, and the lawmakers felt that giving people the power to hear and adjudicate cases is something that will go a long way in ensuring that the cases of sexual harassment are completely, if not completely eliminated, at least significantly reduced. So these are sort of some of the key powers of an IC, which it's important for all of you to sort of remember and sort of keep in mind. We are on slide number 7 now. Again, some of the other aspects that all of you must bear in mind. As an IC, you have a responsibility to promote positive work ethics at the workplace. You have an obligation to filter personal biases out. So when you're hearing a case, sometimes we tend to have positive or negative biases for or against either party. And it's very, very important that even if those any biases that we may have, we need to put them aside and hear the case objectively on merits and on the basis of the evidence that is in front of you. So that's a very important factor that each and every member of the IC must bear in mind. The IC and the company together have to submit an annual report to the district officer at the end of every calendar year. So typically this is submitted between January and February in the following year for the previous calendar year. The IC has an obligation to ensure a safe working environment. So it's not just about hearing cases of it's not just about hearing cases of sexual harassment or complaints that come in, but they have to proactively ensure that the organization has created the right environment for create the right and safe environment for particularly for female employees from a sexual harassment perspective. An IC also has sort of the duty to ensure that justice is made available to survivors of sexual harassment. So if you have made a complaint and the respondent is found guilty, then it's the IC's job to ensure that the right order is passed punishing the guilty person, and also following up with the organization, with the management, to ensure that that IC's order is implemented, because failure to do so means you are in, the management is in violation of the Prevention of Sexual Harassment Act 2013. And of course, lastly, ensure that issues are resolved in a manner least disruptive as far as possible. The IC's primary job is to ensure that they are in compliance with the law, and that they're hearing cases of sexual harassment exactly as the way the law prescribes it. But over and above that, if possible and where possible and permitted, there is a sort of responsibility on the IC, if I may say, to resolve issues in a manner that is least disruptive of the organization's working ecology. So that's sort of really a little bit about duties of an internal committee or an IC. So I'm now going to touch upon a little bit about the IC's role in dealing with a complaint. And this and the next set of slides will be dealt with in greater detail in our sort of forthcoming webinars. But when a complaint first comes in, the IC has a couple of two options really. One is, if the complainant or the aggrieved woman wants to go in for what is called conciliation, they can do so. And conciliation is basically settling the matter through mediation, where both parties agree on the next steps and the way that has to sort of move forward. But if conciliation is not requested for or fails, then the IC moves in for what is called the inquiry or investigation. During the course of the inquiry or investigation, the IC has the power to issue interim orders, submit, and thereafter, the entire inquiry is over, submit a final report, and make sure that they follow up with the employer to ensure implementation of the report. So this is basically the IC's sort of, what the universe, if you will, when a complaint comes in a nutshell. Moving on, sort of a little bit about what interim measures are and how the law views what interim measures are. It could involve, change in a reporting structure. So, for example, if an individual has complained against their reporting manager, then the IC must consider all the possible need for either changing the reporting structure and or additional leave or work from home or so on and so forth. The IC is therefore bound to restrain the respondent from reporting on the complainant's work performance if they are in what we call the matrix of power, and the complainant is reporting into the respondent. There are other alternatives that may be explored as in terms of interim measures, and they're a wide spectrum. We'll cover this in greater detail during the course of our future sessions. We have 4 more sessions, and these that will cover some of these and anything else that is required to ensure business continuity. So this is basically what interim measures are. So in a nutshell, if you can see, the complaint, the timeline is as follows. The first box tells you that the complaint must be filed by the complainant within 3 months of the last incident. This is very, very important. Each of you who is on an IC, and even those of you who are not, if a friend or a colleague is about to file a complaint of sexual harassment, please ensure that they know that the complaint must be filed within 3 months of the last incident. The IC has the power to grant an additional 3 months, but that's in that's up to the IC's discretion. Whereas within the first 3 months of the last incident, it is in the hands of the complainant, and nobody can take that away from the complainant. The IC has exactly 90 days in which to inquire into the complaint and file a sort of submit the recommendations thereafter. So inquiry, 90 days, submission of the report to the management, another 10 days. So basically, post your completion of the inquiry, you have another, which must be completed within 90 days. You have another 10 days to type up and write up your report and then submit that to the management. The management has 60 days to comply with the recommendations of the internal committee. On the 61st day, if the management has not completed or taken action on the report of the IC, then the management is likely to be in default of the Prevention of Sexual Harassment Law 2013. So this is very, very important. The IC's recommendations must be followed by the manager or management rather of the organization within 60 days of the IC's order. There is no sort of compromise on that, right? So some things for you to remember as an IC member: every single complaint that comes before the IC must be investigated. Complaints cannot be summarily dismissed. Every complaint has to be heard, and both parties have to be given a fair opportunity or a fair hearing, a fair opportunity to be heard. So no ex parte orders, as it were. Ex parte orders are orders which are passed by courts or judges or internal committees without hearing both parties. So ex parte orders cannot be done. Of course, the only exception to this is that if a person is not complying with the IC summons to appear before it, then the IC has no choice but to pass an ex parte order because the person is refusing to appear before it. So we'll cover again this concept of what an IC should do when somebody doesn't appear before it and how to deal with it. But essentially, that's the only exception that you have to passing an ex parte order. Very, very important. False complaints must be punished, and this has to be done. The law specifically provides for instances where false complaints are punished, and the only the only aspect that needs to be borne in mind is that the false complaints, the internal committee must specifically conduct a separate inquiry if they believe that an individual has sort of filed a false complaint, and pursuant to the separate inquiry, then they may pass an order that establishes that a false complaint was filed, and therefore that the punishment for filing a false complaint is the same as if it were a case of sexual harassment. So that's the important thing to remember. Kindly note that this punishment is the same, but the IC has to establish that it was a false complaint through a separate inquiry, and then it can sort of once that is established, it can pass an appropriate order. Remember one thing though: the inability of a complainant to provide evidence or substantiate her complaint does not make it a false complaint. A false complaint has to be actually and actively proved, which basically means that, for example, if it is proved that the complainant doctored or forged the evidence, then it's likely that that was a case of a false complaint. So again, we'll cover false complaint in some more detail in sort of the future sessions. Very quickly for you, this is what the complaint these are the things that the complaint needs to satisfy. It must be, in the words of the aggrieved woman, preferably where possible, list of witnesses and evidence has to be provided. And the complainant must inform the IC whether she wants to go in for a conciliation or an inquiry process. Maintaining confidentiality is one of the most important aspects of the law. This is something that must be sort of borne in mind by the complainant, the respondent, the witnesses, and most importantly, the IC. And in case the complainant wants to file an FIR, then the organization has a duty to support that individual and sort of give either moral or any other support that may be required, including by sending somebody along with that particular individual to file an FIR with the local police. The IC must always maintain an empathetic attitude in the event they are speaking to a complainant. But this also goes to the same rule applies even to managers and colleagues to whom a complainant may have actually gone and said, "Listen, I'm facing an incident of sexual harassment and I don't know what to do." So the empathy is very, very important. IC will consider immediate assistance or interim measures. And these are some of the things that must be in the complaint at the time it sort of is filed. These are very, very important. The name of the complainant, date of the complaint, timings, name of the respondent, parties, working relationship between the parties, if any, evidence and witnesses, if any, and so on and so forth. So the objective is just to, in this slide, very quickly give you a full overview of what all goes into a complaint. Again, as I said, we'll cover this in greater detail during our sessions going forward. So what does an IC need to do? Handling data is very critical. It needs to collect inputs from various sources, witnesses, testimonies, statements, so on and so forth. They have to ensure that the crucial or critical information is disseminated appropriately without breach of confidentiality. Accurate records have to be maintained and in a secure and confidential manner. And of course, and so this is basically very, all of these points are very critical from the perspective of maintaining and handling data, which are very important from an IC's perspective. So, we are almost out of time. So this is the last slide. I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to tell you that an IC should record every interaction and minute every conversation, so that you have those details that you can share with a higher court should the matter go up to a higher court and the higher court requests additional information. But it's even without a higher court requesting it, it's always good hygiene, good practice to ensure that you have all the information that you've recorded and minuted every aspect of that case. So always keep accurate and up-to-date records. Ensure that the records are stored securely with restricted access, and importantly, practice positive communication. You're likely to get pressure from senior management and other colleagues who want to know what's happening. You have to, as an IC member, maintain absolute confidentiality and also ensure that but at the same time, you're able to sort of give them whatever very basic information that is required for a manager or a management to continue the work and ensure that there is no further disruption. So this is basically a very quick introduction to what an IC member needs to sort of, the basic essentials of what is required to be an IC member, and some of the key things that you're likely to sort of face as an IC member. So during the course of discharging your duties as an internal committee member.